The United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela.
Delta forces slipped into the home of dictator Nicolás Maduro.
The United States hit Venezuela with a large-scale strike early Saturday and said its president, Nicolás Maduro, had been captured and flown out of the country.
When the United States captured Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, one question immediately followed. Why didn't China intervene? This was not a minor incident. A sitting head of state was removed by American force. China had real stakes. China had billions of dollars in outstanding loans, long-term oil-backed agreements, and infrastructure exposure tied directly to Venezuela's energy sector. Beijing did respond diplomatically, but it stopped there.
And this is the reaction that we are getting from China. China says it firmly opposes U.S. military strikes on Venezuela and the capture of President Nicolás Maduro.
China's foreign ministry issued formal statements condemning the operation as a violation of sovereignty and international norms. Senior officials used legal and diplomatic language to register an objection. And then, nothing more. No military movement, no escalation, no attempt to block or reverse the operation. That distinction matters. Because China did not do nothing. It did exactly what it intended to do. The United States carried out a direct operation in Venezuela. American forces captured Nicolás Maduro, along with his wife, and removed them from power. Washington justified the operation by citing long-standing U.S. criminal indictments, including charges related to narcotics trafficking and terrorism. U.S. officials framed the action as a law enforcement operation, the execution of existing arrest warrants, not a declaration of war. And they argued the move was backed by sanctions law and necessary to prevent Venezuela from being used as a platform for organized crime and hostile activity against the United States. Caracas disputed the legality. Supporters called it an act of aggression. Critics called it unprecedented. China condemned the operation through official channels, without signaling any intention to escalate. That gap between words and action is the real story. For years, China has been portrayed by media and analysts alike as a strategic counterweight to the United States, a rising superpower, a pillar of a multipolar world, a protector of partners against Western pressure. Venezuela appeared to fit that narrative. China bought Venezuelan oil when others stopped. China extended large state-backed loans during Venezuela's economic collapse, often secured against future oil deliveries. China maintained economic ties even as Western governments isolated Caracas. So the assumption felt reasonable. If the United States crossed a red line, China would step in. But that assumption was built on a misunderstanding. It assumed China behaves like traditional military alliances, where political support implies security guarantees. It does not. Since 1949, China has followed a remarkably consistent rule. It avoids direct military intervention outside its immediate geographic and strategic perimeter. Not in Africa, not in the Middle East, not in Latin America. There is only one historical exception, Korea, in 1950. Measured, and that exception explains everything. China entered the Korean War. Because U.S. forces were approaching the Yalu River, China's border, China's survival zone. That decision was not ideological, it was geographic. It was about preventing a hostile military presence from sitting directly on China's frontier. Since then, China has avoided military entanglements abroad. For one overriding reason: escalation is unpredictable. And unpredictability is the greatest threat to China's long-term strategy. China does not pursue prestige through military symbolism. It does not fight distant, symbolic wars. It prioritizes stability above all else. That doctrine did not change for Venezuela, which leads to the critical question: Why was Venezuela never worth more than diplomatic protest? First, economics. By the time this happened, China's Venezuelan exposure was already deeply impaired. Oil production had collapsed. Infrastructure had deteriorated. Returns had diminished sharply. China had already treated much of that exposure as a sunk cost. There was no sudden economic shock to defend. Geography. Venezuela is more than 15,000 kilometers from Beijing. Measured listing, China has no military bases there, no logistics network, no air or naval dominance. Any military intervention would require crossing U.S.-controlled seas to operate inside America's strategic backyard. That would be escalation without operational leverage or strategic upside. Third, hierarchy. China does not commit military force to defend individual governments. It defends systems that sustain China's rise. Venezuela does not sit inside that system. This is the uncomfortable truth. China evaluates partners based on strategic necessity and long-term cost, not emotional loyalty. So it followed its model, it condemned the action, preserved diplomatic positioning, avoided escalation, and absorbed the loss. Not because China was powerless, but because intervention would have been irrational. By that calculation, Venezuela was not worth military escalation. Authoritative China does have red lines, and they are not vague. They are very specific. Taiwan, especially any move toward formal independence, or the establishment of permanent foreign military presence on the island. The South China Sea, including attempts to block or reverse Chinese control over key reefs, islands, or military installations. Direct threats to China's core trade arteries, particularly choke points like the Strait of Malacca, and major sea lanes carrying China's energy and export flows. Large-scale harm to Chinese citizens abroad, especially incidents involving mass casualties or state-level failure to protect them. These are not rhetorical warnings. They are boundaries China has shown it is willing to enforce with force. Now compare that to Venezuela, clear listing. There were no permanent U.S. military bases established that threatened China's security environment. No Chinese citizens were targeted at scale. No disruption to China's shipping lanes or energy routes. No challenge to China's core geography or regional balance of power. None of China's operational or strategic red lines were crossed, which means China's restrained response was never in doubt. Silence was not hesitation. Silence was confirmation. This is where most analysis stops too early, because China did not merely tolerate what happened. China benefited strategically from not intervening. Direct military intervention always carries long-term costs. It burns financial resources at scale, consumes leadership attention, creates new political and diplomatic adversaries, and gradually erodes political legitimacy, particularly among Global South states. By acting directly, the United States absorbed those costs. China did not. The U.S. took the diplomatic backlash, the political pressure, the long-term instability risks that often follow externally driven regime change, and the resentment that lingers after force is used. China preserved its capital, preserved trade relationships, preserved strategic flexibility. This created an asymmetric strategic advantage. China consistently prefers second-mover strategic positioning. Let others act first. Let others spend resources. Let others absorb blame and responsibility. Then adjust policy and posture quietly. China is not trying to confront the United States everywhere. It is letting the United States exhaust itself selectively. That tells us something important about how Chinese power actually works. China does not seek to act as a global security enforcer. China is not an alliance rescue power. China does not react emotionally to events. China is highly selective about when and where it uses force. It intervenes only when core geography is threatened, when internal stability is at risk, or when regime survival is on the line. Everything outside those core interests remains negotiable. That approach can appear passive on the surface to outside observers. But in reality, it is an efficiency-driven power strategy. China did not intervene when the United States captured Nicolás Maduro because Venezuela was never a strategic battlefield. It was a calculated loss and simultaneously a calculated strategic gain. China does not fight everywhere. It lets others pay the price. It fights only where it must, and that difference explains more about Chinese power than any speech or military parade ever could.